Okay, let's take a look at the stomach, the structures of the stomach, and some of the digestive processes that occur in the stomach. So here we have the proximal end of the stomach. Here's the distal end. The proximal end attaches to the esophagus, and here is the lower esophageal sphincter, a circular group of muscles that keeps the stomach contents in the stomach proximally. Distally is the pyloric sphincter, and again, it's another circular group of muscles, or circular muscle rather, that pinches off the distal end of the stomach. Both of these are normally closed, and therefore the stomach can churn its contents back and forth and back and forth. The ability to do that is because of several layers of muscles. We've got longitudinal muscles that run lengthwise. We've got circular muscles that run transversely or in a circular pattern around the stomach. And then lastly, we have oblique muscles. There's a layer of oblique muscles that run diagonally. So it's a combination of all these muscles that allows the food that enters the stomach to mix with gastric juices that we'll talk about in a few minutes and churn back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So it's not the peristalsis of the esophagus. It's not moving food from point A down to point B. It's more like a washing machine, for example. If you look at a washing machine when it's spinning or when it's actually washing, it goes clockwise, counterclockwise, clockwise, counterclockwise, back and forth and back and forth and back. Same thing with the stomach. The stomach is mixing back and forth and back and forth. In that way, it accomplishes two things. It accomplishes mechanical digestion, the physical breakup of food, simply because of the violence of the motion, and also chemical digestion via enzymes and acid. So if we look at the proximal end, the lower esophageal sphincter here, normally it's closed, and it prevents food from backing up into the esophagus, which is very important because, as we've mentioned in the past, the stomach contents are very acidic, along the lines of a pH of about 1 or 2. It's very acidic. You don't want your stomach contents splashing up into the distal esophagus. When that happens, if the distal esophageal sphincter loosens and you get a acid reflux, you can develop what's called GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. And what that does is it allows the stomach contents to go up into the esophagus and start to erode the esophagus because the esophagus can't handle that amount of acidic juice. So if you erode the innermost layer of the esophagus, you eventually will get through to, you'll cause an ulcer, and eventually could get through to the blood vessels, and now you have a bleeding ulcer. So you could have a gastrointestinal bleed, otherwise known as a GI bleed. Another factor, another issue with chronic reflux is it puts you in a higher risk category for patients that later on could possibly develop esophageal cancer. This is why it's important to keep GERD under control. There are a couple ways you can do it. You can pop an acid like Rolaids or Tums, which actually is alkaline, so it acts as a buffer to the stomach acids. Or you can take medications that specifically tell certain cells that we'll learn about in a few minutes in the stomach to slow down the process of producing hydrochloric acid. And last, as far as this slide goes, the distal end of the stomach, as we said, there's the pyloric sphincter. It's a circular muscle that remains closed. Every once in a while, the pyloric sphincter will loosen, will open up, and you'll be able to squirt. The stomach will then constrict, contract, and squirt a little bit of stomach contents at a time into the first section of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum or duodenum. It's important that we don't squirt a whole lot of stomach contents out into the small intestine at a time because it's very acidic, and we need to squirt just a little bit at a time in order to neutralize those stomach acids in the proximal small intestine. So let's take a look at the histology of the stomach. So we have gastric glands here that lead to gastric pits. So basically it's basically a tunnel, and if we zoom in here, we'll see a gastric gland here, and there are multiple cell types in here. We've got parietal cells and sheath cells and other kinds of cells. So basically there are three major kinds of cells we need to know about in the stomach. There are mucus cells, parietal cells, and sheath cells. We'll get to the mucus cells last because that makes most sense. So parietal cells produce hydrochloric acid, HCl, and chief cells produce something called pepsinogen. Anything that ends in -ogen is generally what we call a precursor. So pepsinogen is a precursor to the enzyme pepsin. It needs to be activated though, so it doesn't actually work as an enzyme until it's activated. It gets activated by hydrochloric acid, which is secreted by the parietal cells. So you have pepsinogen gets secreted. When you secrete something, you release something within the body. So the chief cells secrete pepsinogen, which then combines with the hydrochloric acid that is secreted by the parietal cells. An easy way to remember that is parietal cells, starts with a P, parietal, pH, acid. It's an easy way to remember it. So the pepsinogen then reacts with the hydrochloric acid, and the hydrochloric acid then converts the pepsinogen to its active form pepsin. Pepsin is the enzyme, the primary enzyme in the stomach that starts to break down proteins chemically. Okay, so anytime you hear pepsin, like peptide bond, Pepto-Bismol, pepsinogen, it has to do with proteins. So pepsin starts the process of chemical digestion of proteins in the stomach. Now you might wonder, well, okay, if pepsin is breaking down proteins, why doesn't it break down the walls of the stomach? Well, it actually does. Fortunately, the third kind of cell are mucus cells. And mucus cells have two jobs. Number one, it's to produce mucus to protect the lining, the innermost lining of the stomach. And secondly, they produce bicarbonate, HCO3-. And it's the HCO3-, there's a layer of bicarbonate that lines the inside of the stomach that neutralizes the hydrochloric acid. That way, we don't get the inside of your stomach eaten through or corroded. If, however, you produce too much acid, the parietal cells produce too much hydrochloric acid, or if there's some sort of dysfunction of the mucus layer, you can erode the innermost lining of the stomach, and we call that an ulcer. And again, just as with the esophagus, you might end up with a bleeding ulcer if you erode down to the submucosal layer, which contains blood vessels, as shown on this diagram here. So together, the hydrochloric acid coming from the parietal cells, and the pepsinogen coming from the chief cells, and the mucus coming from the mucus-producing cells, that combined with the food contents, the bolus that came via peristalsis through the lower esophageal sphincter, all that mixed up forms what we call gastric juices. The gastric juices are the secretions combined out with the food, and we call that chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. And it's a liquidy substance where the mechanical digestion has gotten to a point where the food is made up of very small particles, and as we said, chemical digestion has started. So chyme is the term for the liquidy stomach contents that get squirted out periodically through the pyloric sphincter.